Another step in getting this race car on track as I rebuild a mangled sheet metal firewall. I hoped this would be a bigger update, but what should have been a trivial reassembly job turned into a small fabrication one instead. I just want to keep things moving, so here is a brief video on that part. In the last video, I did some general fabrication in order to install some bushings for the new harnesses. What I expected to be doing in this video was welding in the mounts for the new fuel cell, as well as new mounts for the battery and fire suppression tank. But as I started trying to put the firewall back together, it was clear that the original sheet metal piece was beyond repair. No matter how much I massaged it or tried to force it, it just wasn't playing ball, and it was particularly important that this be flat because there was a whole bunch of sheet metal that was going over the top of it. Without stripping down the whole car, I couldn't see how a single piece design was ever going to fit without being rebent. Therefore, I made the decision to rebuild the sheet metal firewall using a two-piece design, just like the fibrous cement underneath, except this new one would overlap in the middle to make sure everything was sealed. Although not that cheap, there was an easy supply of aluminium sheet metal in the matching 0.5mm thickness from Bunnings, the hardware store that's everywhere in Australia. So I visited them and stocked up. The first step was to once again contort the sheet metal to get it out of the car, and I think by the bending you're seeing here, it's easy to understand how it got so twisted in the first place and why I want to switch to a two-piece design. I also pulled out the fibro sheets that were still intact and flat, and they would serve as the basis for my template. Time for some CAD in the traditional sense, cardboard aided design. I took a big enough piece and laid down the fibro on top in position. I wasn't sure if there was a little gap between the two halves, so I got the sheet metal, pushed it flat as best as I could, and tried to check all of the hole alignment. After this verification was complete, I broke out a Sharpie and carefully traced around the fibro, trying very hard not to bump it and ruin its position. Sometimes I can butcher simple things like this, but in this case it worked out pretty well. Back to the sheet metal to once again push it flat and just double check everything lined up. And from there I made a couple of adjustments just to get a bit more material around the holes. For me, that's a minor masterpiece. Time to split my piece of cardboard into the two halves. I measured from the center out on each side and then drew a vertical line down where I wanted the overlap to be. Next up, the cutting, and my cutting mat was woefully undersized, so I had to be pretty careful to cut in short segments to not cut into my floor. Repeating this bit by bit, including some fiddly bits in the corners, and our cardboard template is really taking shape. This seemed like an opportune time to head back to the car and to massage the cardboard template back into position to make sure everything fit. And I'm pleased to report that it absolutely did. So back inside the house with a second piece of cardboard, the job this time being to trace the first template to make a second. This one, however, only needed to be 1/2, so I utilized the edge of the cardboard, lining it up with the division line I had drawn earlier, and once the outline was complete, I once again cut this one out with a knife. Did my two templates match? Absolutely. I happened to get this right on the first go, and I mentioned before that sometimes I butcher these fiddly little things, so everything at this stage was going about as good as I could have hoped. At this point, I could get out the blade and cut the original template down its segmentation line, and that at last gave me the two halves that I needed, and as you can see, they overlap quite nicely in the middle. Back to the car for another test fit, and this half-size panel was so much easier to get into place, which told me my decision to split it into two was absolutely worthwhile. Regarding the harness bushing welding, I've got pictures of everything for the logbook inspector, but there's a chance you'll want to see it firsthand, so removal of these panels in the future should be as straightforward as possible. Now you'll notice with my cardboard templates, I didn't bother doing any holes, and that's because I wanted to get them in position on the car before punching through the holes perfectly in line with my riv nuts. I could then get a bolt through the new hole, realign the panel, and continue punching the next. With two bolts in position, the panel would now hold itself, and I could concentrate on punching the more difficult to reach holes. We can see that down in the lower left, this hole is a little bit too close to the edge, so I'll be adding more material here when transferring to sheet metal. To get the final positions as accurate as possible, I tightened all of these bolts before tracing onto the cardboard around the outside of the bolt head, and this was particularly important for some of the bolts on the edge, as I had to stab through multiple times before I finally got them aligned with the riv nut underneath. So far, you're probably thinking that everything is going a little too well. Alright, so here's where things started to go wrong. I traced the pattern onto the sheet metal, and my jigsawing skill was just not up to the task. Not only did the foot of the jigsaw scratch the top of the panel, but it left quite a jagged edge, but worst of all, the edge of the panel was no longer flat. I solved this skill problem by throwing money at it, returning to the hardware store to get a nibbler, some shears, and a replacement piece of sheet metal. One upside is that the panel that I had already butchered was suitable to start practicing on. Using the shears and the nibbler, I could make my mistakes before it really counted. What I learned is that the shears were only good in a straight line, and the nibbler could go around corners, but it needed to be held at a certain angle to not jam, and even then you needed a keen eye to get the width right and not cut off too much. The edge this left was pretty good, but it could be improved by using a Dremel tool to do a little bit more shaping and deburring. With the outline complete, I reintroduced the cardboard template and used my Sharpie circles as a guide to drill the holes in the very center. Remember that this is not the final panel, but I'm trying to apply practice makes perfect, so another test fit was in order to make sure that everything was lining up. And it did, so I could progress by doing this on a fresh sheet. I transferred everything over by tracing and then did all of the straight lines with the shears, making sure to not cut the whole way until the tips touched, as that would put a nasty little divot on the edge. I then used a rubber mallet and a timber block to try and get the edges as flat as possible before using the Dremel to complete the deburring. And just to make sure I wasn't going to slice myself open, I got a sanding block and used it at various angles just to round the edge of the panel. I initially tried to use a deburring tool, but the panel just seemed to flex and its effectiveness was quite limited. Since I wasn't as confident with the nibbler, I tried to ensure there was as little of this as possible to complete. Unfortunately, those little segments went pretty smoothly, followed by more cleanup and deburring. Here is my completed sheet. It's not perfect, but for me it's pretty good, and it's way better than the panel that I am replacing. The next step was to align the new sheet metal with the old fibro panel, and then if necessary use a drill to open up holes in the new locations. Most of these were already pretty close, but they needed to be exact. I bolted the right hand panel into its position on the car without the fibro to ensure it wasn't too thick, and then bolted the left hand cardboard template into position and traced all of the bolt holes to get them exact. And now all of the next steps are familiar because I'm doing them for the second time. We traced the template onto the sheet metal, cut out with shears for the straight lines, complementing this with the nibbler for the curves, before cleaning up and deburring with the grinding tool, and a final pass with a sanding pad. After the holes are drilled and transferred to the fibro underneath, the whole thing can be installed for the final time. Obviously we start at the top, putting in some bolts on the edge, before we introduce the left hand panel, overlapping it in the middle, and inserting the bolts across the top that lock the two together. But here's where things got really tricky, and it became quite a frustrating job. Because of difficult access for the drill, many of the rib nuts were inserted on a slight angle. So despite the fact that all of the holes lined up with the rib nuts, I couldn't actually see the tip of the rib nut and know what angle I needed to approach from. So I have to admit it took a really long time to get all of these bolts in. We're talking days of doing it in short stints as I battled frustration. And I'm not sure if these pictures do it justice, but you can see these bolts are in on a bit of a strange angle. At least if I'm ever putting the panels back on, they'll be slightly bent around the bolt hole and I'll know which angle to approach from. Overall, this should have been a pretty simple job, but that last complication made it so I was glad that it was finally over. To finish off, I finally patched up the holes that were left behind from where the original seat mounts were cut out. This was still a little far from my eyes to be ideal, but it was still a lot easier to access than when I was welding at the very bottom of the chassis, putting in the harness bushes. The next video should finally be the installation and plumbing of the new fuel cell, and after that, pouring the new custom foam seat. And that will put me in reach of finally driving this car on the racetrack.